Thank you, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity, Stuart. I am using somebody else's slides, so bear with me, please, everybody. And to start with, I just did want to have a look at this as a whole, in that it isn't just about mediation. In my view, I think we've got to go right back to the beginnings of the pandemic in 2020 and see what the court wanted to do and what the court did, because I think that's the starting point, not just about mediation. So if we can all cast our minds back to 5 years ago, actually this week, and the world seemed like it was going to end. And I remember at the time I was working at Hodge, Jones and Allen, and I'd taken the day off and I got a panic phone call saying, don't bother coming in. We're all going into lockdown. I had a court hearing the next day. And what do we do? Well, over the course of a couple of years, the courts actually had quite a few decent ideas. And there are two cases which are a little old now, which I'm just going to go through. I'm actually just going to mention them. So there were two. The first one is Ray Blackfires Limited, and this was where the High Court refused the claimant's application to adjourn a 5-week trial because the reason the claimant wanted it adjourned was there were going to be several witnesses, a fact and expert witnesses, and of course we come back to the old argument of everybody's got the right to a fair trial, which was thrown into the mix, and the court just said no. There's no reason why, and ordered the parties to cooperate by exploring ways in which a remote trial might proceed. And this was again looked at in Britta UK Limited and others, and SVS Securities PLC, and exactly the same thing. And this was to do with trial of dishonest assistance, another 5-week trial, and the court said no, it's got to go ahead virtually. So if a court can do it with all its moving parts and the actual length of time, there shouldn't be any reasons why a mediation should be any different, surely. And there's a far more recent court hearing, which is Perseus Ventures Limited and Foskett, which was heard in October last year. And HHJ Pierce set out some very relevant factors for the court to consider when deciding whether to order a remote hearing. I mean, I'm sure everybody realises that a lot of the shorter procedural ones now, by matter of course, take place online, which is quite useful. But HHJ Pierce said the following, and I think these do apply to when we're looking at mediations. So convenience. So where parties are far apart, as we've just heard, where there may be a disability or some neurodivergence, if the parties would prefer it to happen that way. Efficiency, maintaining the integrity of the hearing. So this was an issue where he felt that questions over who is representing or speaking on behalf of a party and whether they are entitled to may be more easily ascertainable in person. And I think, again, this is something we'll look at again when we come to mediation. Issues over recording the hearing was something that was raised. You can't police it as you can when you're in person in court. And then finally, ensuring confidence in the legal system. And that's the old Human Rights Act defence of right to a fair trial. So if we now put that into effect when we look at mediation. Oh, sorry, Stuart, I thought this hadn't come through to you, but so there we go. Two of the cases. So here we go. Overview of mediation, traditional versus virtual formats, the growth of virtual mediation post-pandemic, and the importance of understanding challenges in both settings. So that's the way we're going to look at this, if we may. And I would encourage a bit of audience participation here, because I'd love to hear your experiences, especially with the virtual side of things, because I think out of everything I've done over the last 5 years, I think I've had 4, 2 of which I did myself, 2 which I was acting for a party on, and not one of them actually settled on the day. So it would be interesting to hear what everybody else's experiences of it are, because practically I think is very different to talking about it theoretically. So communication engagement issues, virtual mediation. So I suppose this is pros and cons. Risk of miscommunication due to lack of body language. I think that also goes though for people talking over each other. I find it's far easier to misunderstand when somebody's going to stop speaking or wants to put some. I mean, how does everybody else feel about that generally?
You end up interrupting each other, and then everyone's stopping, and then everyone's starting again because you don't know if you're being allowed to interrupt or not. And if you're in person, that all happens quite organically. When you've got that split-second delay, I think actually it potentially creates a little bit of politeness, because if someone does interrupt, the other person tends to stop because they know otherwise they're going to get caught in this cycle of delay.
I think that's true. I also think it has the weird effect of almost being a bit more calming, because you can't see people's body language. So when you get somebody really riled up in a meeting, sometimes if it's on camera, that actually does help. And I had one, gosh, it would be during the pandemic, where I was acting for a client, and she wasn't the most pleasant of people, and she decided that she didn't want to see anybody in the face, she didn't want to look anybody in the eye, and she had her camera off the whole time. And I think she was able to avoid responsibility in that situation, as well as hiding her true feelings. Another issue: screen fatigue, reducing engagement. Does anybody see that as a problem? No. Ah, fabulous. Interesting. Well, that's interesting. I've noticed they are shorter, but then maybe that's because mine just don't settle. I don't know. Technical issues disrupting conversations. Now, this is one of my proper bête noirs, I'm afraid. Anything I touch seems to go fizz, pop, bang. So computers don't work for me.
I speak with tenants and a housing association, and there was 30 tenants on one side and the housing association on the other. And it was that classic scenario where the local authority housing association wanted to replace the roof on the building at a cost of £150,000, and all the tenants were people who couldn't afford their share of the bill. And they were all saying, well, the only reason the roof needs to be replaced is because you failed to maintain it. And that was kind of the issue. And we had to break people into groups, and the logistics of getting people into subgroups and making sure that when I was talking to people that there was no way the people on the other side, I was acting as mediator at the start, no way people on the other side could inadvertently hear what I was saying. And the care I had to take to make sure I was going in and out of the correct room was a little stressful, I'll be honest, because if you inadvertently click on the wrong room and then start saying something, you can mess up the whole mediation. But I agree with the technical side of it. When it's two parties, it's not so much of a challenge.
I mean, I've got to say I struggle with MS Teams, and that was something I was going to ask. Who prefers that? Can we just do a quick straw poll? Because I'm going to go back to our IT boys and say this. Who prefers to do it on MS Teams if you've done it? Who prefers Zoom?
Zoom.
Yeah, I'm Zoom. That's just about 50-50. Yeah. No, because I just find Zoom putting people in rooms is easier actually than messing around on MS Teams. Yeah, okay. In-person mediation, more personal, but emotions can escalate. We touched on that, and I think that's actually really true. Also, the physical presence, especially I've been in an awful lot of litigant in-person mediations recently, and watching out for vulnerabilities between the two is a lot easier in person than it is on Teams. I mean, for example, I had one recently where we'd had all the pre-mediation stuff, and it was a man and a woman, and there'd been a romantic entanglement, and it was all over a company. They'd all fallen out because one didn't want to go out with the other anymore, and it was very dramatic. But over the computers, he was really came across as really aggressive and, you know, quite a big big buff guy, and she came across as quite petite and mouse-like. In real life, he was actually a tiny guy with a big ego, and she was actually quite a, you know, Amazon-esque, I'd say, woman. But you wouldn't have got that. You wouldn't have got that on the computer. So that does feed into, as a mediator, just seeing how you're going to have to deal with the parties, especially when there's a vulnerability there.
Virtually not happening before distance.
Yeah.
And it's getting that confidence of the person, when you stand with the person better. So I find it creates more of an even pre-mediation discussion. Feel like you get over the fact you get understanding of who you are, and just feel like you talk to them more frankly, virtually than necessarily of the person.
I agree. I completely agree with that. And I mean, I'm all about, you know, chatting and meeting with people, having a glass of wine with them. And I think you get to know people far better in life anyway than you can over the screen. I mean, to go off on a complete tangent, I remember in the first week or first month of the pandemic doing do's with chambers, and we'd all be sat round having half a bottle of white wine, you know, with people that you normally saw at a, you know, in a pub, and it just didn't work. Next one. Confidentiality and security concerns, virtual mediation. We came about this, and the court brought this up, didn't they, with maintaining the integrity of the hearing, not being able, so, you know, not knowing when it was being recorded and it shouldn't be. So here, risks of data breaches, hacking or recording without consent. I do think these are issues. And again, if we talk about litigants in person, we know, I mean, acting as a solicitor, I'm damn sure my clients are tape recording me half the time anyway, so they can, you know, have a go when things don't go their way. Data breaches is a big one at the moment. I mean, I know we've had quite a few phishing attempts recently that have been well backed off by our IT department, but it is a general risk, especially when the duty of confidentiality and goodness knows what else, especially on high profile things where you are acting for perhaps people in the public eye and that kind of thing. Stuart's already mentioned this, difficulty ensuring private discussions. Who else is in the room? Can you make sure that mediation agreement is binding on everybody there? You know, is somebody's mum sitting in the corner playing Candy Crush or whatever they're playing nowadays? And then here, use of secure platforms like Zoom with encryption. I mean, my view is Zoom's far superior. So unfortunately, my other partner over there believes MS Teams, so you're not going to help me with this battle with our IT department, are you? No. In person, physical confidentiality is easier to maintain. I do agree. The only thing I would say is nobody's going to stop anybody being sat there with a recording device in person. But physically, as a mediator, you can see who is there, who needs to be beaten into signing that mediation agreement. Potential risk of documents being misplaced or seen by others. Yeah, but we've been doing it for hundreds of years this way. I don't really think that's a massive problem. You know, the number of people that read paper documents on trains with people seeing them is a problem in itself. Logistical and accessibility challenges. Now, I think this is where virtual mediation really does come into its own.
Just things. I think this brings it back to the importance of explaining confidentiality and explaining what it means. Because certainly, you know, I've had it in person where as soon as you go out of the room, actually they're on their phone to their mate. And then, you know, there's certain things that you might notice about what they're saying too often they've been doing that, and they're just kind of almost weaving into the conversation as you go. I think you do need to weave it in both ways.
Yes.
I'm not sure it is really that different because, you know, in person, as soon as you step out.
I think the difference is, and I've had this actually nothing to do with mediation, dealing with employees when they've been a bit naughty. They've been on Zoom, they've been on loudspeaker on the computer, and there's somebody listening in the background. I think it can be, what can I say? It's almost encourages dishonesty somehow, because you can have somebody that isn't seen sat there listening in real time. And that's my own risk, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think confidentiality with any of these things is difficult to maintain anyway. And making sure they understand that confidentiality in the mediation agreement is key. I've had one recently where they've tried to get me involved in settlement negotiations after it failed. It's like, sorry, if you want to do it proper mediation style, yes, but I'm not going to write to your solicitor and tell them exactly what's happened. So maybe that's my fault for not getting through to them, but the confidentiality aspect is one of the things that makes it so lovely.
Just another thing that I think is a big issue. Someone else being in the room like that is how it changes the dynamic.
Yes.
You're not even aware they're in the room.
Mm.
You can just see the person's face. But if their husband's there telling them what to say, or whatever, then that's changing the dynamic, and you're not in control of that.
Mm. I think also it comes down to the vulnerabilities of people as well. As a mediator, understanding the parties' positions and the vulnerability. If they're having somebody whispering in their ear, they're not. Are they making the decision of their own volition? But I think this is like I said, I think this is the big pro for virtual mediation. It is easier access for people all over the country. So if you've got, or over the globe, if you're acting for people in different jurisdictions, I do think it's a changer, because you're on an equal footing when it comes to the cash. As we've also spoken, if people neurodiverse may prefer it being on screen. Technology barriers, poor internet, lack of digital skills, I think is a genuine problem, especially with certain sectors of society. Is somebody going to have enough Wi-Fi if they're from a lower socioeconomic part of society? An elderly person may struggle. Time zone differences can complicate scheduling. I think that's two-pronged though, because I think, yes, it can, but it also enables somebody, if they're really serious about mediating dinner to 3 o'clock in the morning in Canada, it can work either way. In-person mediation, travel costs and time commitment, obviously. The venue booking and availability is an issue I found. And me and my husband had a rather wonderful 6 months where we just went round hotels around Great Britain, getting views on their availability for putting up mediations, and we very often got an upgrade or a free night because we were even inquiring, just a hint. Although also, if I can advertise, Ellisons, our Ipswich office is perfect if anybody wants to run a mediation from Ipswich, £500 a party plus VAT. And it is limited flexibility compared to the virtual options. It's, you can turn off and on, you can go and make dinner for your kids and come back an hour later. It is far more flexible, I think. So conclusion. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, depends on the case. Hybrid approaches. Now, I've not talked about that. How do people feel about hybrid approaches? Because I think it can, I don't think it does, but I think there can be a perceived issue of somebody not getting a fair crack of the whip. And that was part of the discussion that happened with the court system. They wanted both parties to be in court or both parties to be online. I can see you nodding at the back. Have you had experiences on that?
Yeah, but it's weighing up, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
I mean, imagine you're in a meeting and it's a hybrid meeting. What do we all do? We all talk to the people who are physically present, and the people who are on the TV screen tend to get a back seat. But on the other hand, you've got to encourage people sometimes to mediate, and one of the things which might dissuade them is the fact that they've got to schlep somewhere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that as long as you can reassure everyone that they'll get a fair hearing, whatever they're on, then I'd recommend.
Yes.
I've seen resistance where I've only seen it work, and I've seen resistance if it's not like this, where so you might have solicitor and client in a room somewhere physically, solicitor and client in a room physically somewhere, and the mediator at home. They
Okay.
don't want the mediator in one of the offices and not in the other office.
Was yours on last Friday? Was that hybrid?
Yes.
Yeah. How did that? How did that? Did it work quite
I mean,
seamlessly?
it's very,
Yeah,
um,
but they came into the office,
they
didn't they?
use
Yeah.
it. And then mediator was online and from home, and I don't really care where the others were. You know, it wasn't. I think they were in a room together. But as I say, I don't really mind if their clients at home or solicitors at home. But the point was that no one wanted the mediator in one office with one party, which again, I suppose suggests there is an advantage. That we're saying that it's fine virtually, but actually perhaps there, we accept that there is an advantage to being physically with somebody.
It's risk perception, isn't it? The person that is physically in the room with the other person's not quite as committed.
Yes.
Not workplace. So you need that commitment. So when they go, I'm just going to take, it's fun, but actually they've had to make the effort. They've had to cancel their clinics or whatever.
I'm struck from spoken to Kay earlier, a strong word when she made about mediation last week, which we provided mediators for, and that it's easy just to leave. It's one of the sort of perennial issues with mediators when people say, I always say to them, look, if you get to the point where you've had enough and you want to leave, please don't just go, please talk to me first. Then you have a chance to persuade you that there's an opportunity still here. Whereas like you said, when you've got a red button which just says leave, you just click it and away you go. So that's an issue. I was struck by that. And the other point that is interesting is in terms of, for me, when I'm recommending mediator, if it's online, it gives me a lot more flexibility because I have 27 mediators and I want to try and find people that are a good fit. And I might have four people say that are a good fit, but geographically they're not a good fit. So the question from my point of view is obviously, how do I, sometimes I kind of feel like I want to steer the client to a virtual because it gives me a bigger spread of choices. And then I can say, well, actually, I've got someone who is a really good fit here. The problem is on the other side of the country. So there's a balance to be struck there.
I suppose it's what you, I remember doing this when I was maybe 20 years ago, was, not getting anywhere with the other side. Right, come on, we're putting focus on, let's see if that makes a difference when we were acting for a party. And the mediator would all of a sudden start panicking, thinking, oh no, come on, we've got to try and get a bit. So there is a psychological advantage. It's a bit like playing poker, I suppose, really, isn't it? Giving a slight peek of what you think your hands are. Hybrid approaches can offer the best of both worlds. I think that's true. But I think you've got to be careful to make sure that everybody understands what it's about and that nobody feels disadvantaged. Ensure security, engagement strategies and accessibility in both formats. I think we've discussed that here, that we need to make sure that the clients understand what they're getting themselves in for, especially important where you're acting for the litigants person. And final thoughts, I think this is a very good thought, actually, that the key to successful mediation is adapting to the needs of the parties involved. And I think that is vital with any kind of litigation, really, but especially with mediation, to get the best outcome you can. You do need to think about, as a mediator, what the parties need to get to that agreement. Can I just ask though about perhaps drafting the settlement agreement? How far, because I've never got that far with a virtual mediation. How does that work? Is it just pinging through on email? Yeah. Interesting. Has anybody got any questions, thoughts?
I would say that since 2020, when I could, having trained as a mediator, and it all being about these soft skills, body language, and building rapport. The thought of doing that on a two-dimensional screen just seemed too difficult. But now I find it works really well, and it might need to be a bit more explicit about building rapport. But it still does work, in my opinion.
Thank you.
The other thing I find, which I don't think has been mentioned, is that remote mediation is cheaper.
Yes.
Because you don't have the downtime, because you will be off undertaking other work rather than sitting in a room like a Candy Crush.
Yeah, but also, the costs of the venue as well are taken out, the cost of
And
having to
travel.
buy everybody's sandwich and travel. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it is, and I think the ones I have led myself have all been very short, and they've been very low value, fast track matters. Actually, they've been, with not very complicated. The ones that I've done when I've been advising one of the parties have been unsuccessful because I think of the complications, and the people that were litigating would have been better being put in a room with the other side rather than on a screen, because I think it makes it more real. I think for very difficult clients, I think, put them in a room with some cold coffee and see how they like it at 10 o'clock at night. And I think sometimes you do get a result the old fashioned way, really, that way.
Remote hearing, so remote mediation, there's a lot to be said for it, but I suppose I still find it petrifying, the whole technology part, and I've done both formats, and I have to say I still worry about, you click off parts and can you still be heard. So I'll move rooms and I'll call people from a different part of the house or a different part of the office, just because I've had a few situations, none of which have come to anything that's been an issue, and not in the mediation context where you think you clicked off a call or the screen has frozen. So I still have this real fear. And I also find in mediation, when you're doing a remote one, it's not like being in person when you call it, let's all have a break. And I think people go out for a walk and they're kind of mulling over. I sometimes feel when I'm, in a remote context, people have just gone off to do the washing.
Yeah.
Or they have gone to do something completely unrelated to the mediation. And when people come back to the screens, I just feel like you're just sort of where you left off, rather than sometimes people have reflected, processed, and are ready to move on in their thoughts. But I think you miss that progression that can sometimes come from the day is to be focused on this and we're all going to work really hard on this. I think you can lose people.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
And I don't feel that the breaks are as constructive.
Mm.
They're needed. They're far more needed in a remote mediation, but I think they're not as constructive because people are just going, doing whatever they're doing. They're just not thinking about the mediation during the break.
I mean, the first point about problems with breakout rooms, is there a need for specialist IT? That's the other thing. That'd be wonderful if we could.
Love that. Yeah, I would love that, because you think, I'm an employment lawyer like Paul, and just some of the misconduct cases I've dealt with where people have been overheard, or a transcript is downloaded in the notes section, and a couple of my disciplinary cases where people think they're having a private conversation, and just the things that have gone wrong, even with people being very careful, and you can't quite explain how on earth it's happened. And neither can the IT people sometimes. So, and I will say my IT skills are absolutely awful. So I'm sure I'm a bit behind the curve of some. But yeah, I do think specialist IT would be wonderful, where that you knew that those things can't go wrong, and you could just feel a bit more relaxed, because there's so much to be thinking about during the mediation. Making people comfortable, taking into account their needs, what's really important to them, and you want to be really relaxed. And if part of you is thinking, what could go wrong with this? You've got an eye on that kind of can impact your credibility as well as a mediator or as a party where the IT just doesn't work. You kind of sometimes feel personally responsible for that, don't you? And you can just take the focus away from the day. So
just to make you feel worse, I probably shouldn't be sharing this with everybody, but in a mediation I did recently it was 1 AM, so I think I've got some extenuating circumstances. I forgot I was sharing my screen and said something disparaging on Teams to a colleague because I was at my wit's end. I genuinely was at my wit's end. And and someone had to remind me that I was sharing my screen. And obviously it was, luckily the actual words I used were not very explicit words, and I think if they were, I'd have been sacked. Because
so we've all had situations like that. I was on a court hearing, and the office IT wouldn't let the Ministry of Justice system through. I had to drive home to continue the hearing, and I'm phoning my other half going, I can't believe the system didn't work, and the guy, and excuse me, Mrs. Dixon, I can still hear you. Oh, sorry, I'm in my car driving home. How has that happened? That I've left the office, I've come off my laptop, my phone's in my bag, and I heard the judge from my handbag, and I'm thinking, how did that happen? You can repeat it. I still don't know how that happened. But anyway, maybe I tried to switch device in my desperation during cross-examination, and the judge was in my handbag. So
I think an observation I would add, similar to Dawn, would be the difference between virtual and in person. From a mediator's perspective, when you're moving between rooms, you're physically moving between rooms, the mediator gets an opportunity just to kind of reset, take a breath, think about what to do next. Whereas virtually, unless you're really careful, you're in the room before you know it, you're off. You don't have that pause moment.
That's actually said. I actually like doing virtual. I find it easier because you're kicking it between the other person switching rooms, and it's almost like you pull yourself out of it easier than you do when you're in person because they're watching you. But I think time to have that pause out and have that thing.
Yeah.
I find that easier with virtual than I do in person.
Interesting, but certainly a different dynamic to be aware of.
Thank you. I think that's been rather insightful. And I'll go back and tell my IT it's Zoom all the way. I'm just going to lie. But thank you very much.
Thank you.